Today, we look at The Road Less Traveled by M.Scott Peck. This book takes a different approach to most other spiritual books, as the author is a psychiatrist and therefore uses a psychological approach. As always, we will be splitting this book into the summary section and the review section. Please check the timestamps below to get to the section of the video you would like to watch. Okay, so let's start by reviewing this book. The aspects of this book that I liked were firstly the different perspective. As I mentioned above, this author of this book is a psychiatrist and therefore he brings in a psychological perspective and he combines this with his experience from years of treating patients. Secondly, he's honest about the path being difficult. Throughout the book, the author makes a point to emphasize that the work needs to be done by the individual and cannot be done by anybody else. And this is very important as people put too much emphasis on the outside factors and not enough emphasis on the internal factors. Thirdly, this book is quite practical. When the author gives concepts, he often gives tools, tips, and things to watch out for when trying to implement the concepts he has mentioned. And finally, the author has an interesting and different view on the role of discipline and love in spiritual growth. He also then defines religion and grace in a very different way to the norm. Now, let's look at the aspects of this book that I didn't like. So my copy of this book is an audiobook, and this audiobook is presented by the author. And this can often be a good thing, as the author can better explain his concepts. But unfortunately, I found the author to be quite dry and difficult to follow, and found myself drifting off many times. Secondly, irrelevant examples. Normally, authors use examples to help us better understand and implement the concepts they talk about. But I found in this book that the author sometimes used examples that held little to no benefit to the reader. Thirdly, the fourth section of this book is quite controversial. In this section of the book, the author talks about some of his own theories on subjects such as miracles and original sin. And this is not ideal if you're looking for a purely psychological perspective. And even for people who are religious, the views can be quite out there and put you off of the whole book. And this is a shame, as the first two sections of the book have a lot of wisdom. Finally, I found that the last two sections had a lot less useful information compared to the first two sections. And this is partly due to the author talking about his theories and religion, and these theories can be quite out there and will only reign true for a select few individuals. Whereas his first two sections are a lot more practical and simple and can be applied by anyone no matter their views. So, would I recommend that you read this book? This was a difficult decision, but I do believe there was enough content in the first two sections for this book to be worth a read. And if you do decide to read this book, I would recommend going for either the physical copy or the ebook. Okay, let's move on to the summary. This book is split into 4 distinct sections. These are discipline, love, growth and religion, and grace. Okay, so let's start with discipline. So, why would you need discipline in your life? Let's first take the fact that life is difficult, and problems will sometimes arise in your life, and dealing with them may be painful. This is similar to the Buddhist concept of suffering in the Four Noble Truths. Our options are then either to avoid problems, which can lead to mental disorders or other problems, or we deal with our problems, which may lead to pain in the moment, but will lead to future growth. For example, if you had a problem with speaking to new people, this would be difficult, as many daily activities require us to speak to new people, and you'd also struggle to make new friends. And you can see how this would lead to more problems. The second option would be to deal with the problem right now. This would create immediate suffering, but lead to growth in that there is so many more activities you could now do without having to suffer. So here are some tools that will help you deal with the problems that arise in life. Firstly, delayed gratification. This involves suffering now to have a more pleasurable future. And this is an important skill for the individual to master, as it can be applied to so many aspects of your life, such as health and fitness, finance, and spiritual growth. A good example from the spiritual growth category would be dealing with problems as they arise. This might lead to suffering in the present moment, but once the problem is solved, this leads to growth as you can now deal with more situations. So the second tool is accepting responsibility for problems. This involves a delicate balancing act between taking too much responsibility and not taking enough responsibility. And the third tool is dedication to the truth. Here we have to choose truth over comfort. This involves constantly examining and contemplating what you believe to be true, and not telling lies to yourself to make things easier. An example of this would be in saying to yourself that you don't have time to do spiritual growth or meditation every day as your schedule is too busy, but then in the evenings you're spending an hour watching TV or on social media. This is then choosing comfort over truth, and it should be the other way around. The second type of lie is the lie you tell to another person. And this is a bit more difficult, as telling the truth is not always beneficial to another person's spiritual growth. So here's some tools to use when deciding whether or not to tell the truth to another. Firstly, remember that withholding the truth is the same as lying. Secondly, make sure you aren't lying for personal gain. This involves saying negative things about another person that you know are not true, or saying something that is untrue, whether it be blaming someone else for something you did, or just denying the fact that you did it. And then thirdly, you have to think, will telling the truth help this person grow? And this can sometimes be difficult to discern and will take practice. And sometimes you may just not know. The fourth and final tool is balancing. And this involves finding the middle way in all the above tools and is very similar to the concept of the middle way in Buddhism. And it will be challenging to find this middle way, and sometimes you may find yourself on either end of the spectrum, and this is okay as long as you are trying to improve and return back to the middle and balanced way. So you will have to decide when to delay gratification and when to enjoy the present moment. You'll also have to decide when to take responsibility for a problem and when to realize that the problem is not your fault. And finally, you'll have to decide when it is right to tell the truth and when it is right to tell a lie. And the middle way in each of these tools is a fluid thing and will change with time and as your goals change. Section 2. Love. What is love? Love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. This is known as true love and must not be confused with falling in love and the passion that results when you first fall in love. And therefore, true love can only occur when passion is lacking. And true love is the path to joy, as it allows for your own spiritual growth and the spiritual growth of the other. Here are some tips the author gives to nurture true love. Tip 1. True love is not dependency, as dependency is more like the relationship of a parasite, where it requires everything from the host but gives nothing in return. So one must be aware that love relationships can easily turn into dependent relationships when you require too much from the other and do not give anything in return. Tip 2. Commitment. You will need commitment because as the passion begins to fade, you will start to notice aspects of the other person that bother you that never used to. You also won't be as motivated to go out of your way for the other person. You and your partner therefore have to be committed to the growth of each other as well as the growth of the relationship. Tip 3 is attention. Attention is the act of listening to another for no other reason than to help the other person. There are different types of listening, and in different situations, different types of listening are needed. For instance, sometimes people just need to blow off some steam, and they need the other person there just to listen to the problem without trying to find any solutions to it. And at other times, they'll need you to listen and help them find a solution to the problem. It is therefore your job to decide when to help and offer assistance and when just to listen. Tip 4. Courage. You need courage because the act of loving someone puts you at risk of losing them and the associated suffering. But the act of loving someone else is an important factor to spiritual growth. Step 5. Balance. Here you've got to balance between helping the one you love and letting them walk their own path and make their own mistakes. Section 3. Growth and religion. Currently, religion has too narrow a definition, and the author believes that it needs to be a much more encompassing term, including all the views and ideas that makes up one's worldview, and thus everyone would then have a religion. Secondly, he points out that religion can also hinder or promote the spiritual growth of an individual, and this is dependent on the interpretation of the religion and its principles. The final point he makes in this section is that science and religion seem like opposites, as those who are very scientific cannot be very religious, and those who are very religious cannot be very scientific. He says they should be used together because then the strength of the one could counter the weakness of the other, and thus lead to better spiritual and scientific growth. And the final section is grace. The author's definition of grace is a universal force that assists spiritual growth and includes what one would describe as miracles. The author then gives examples as proof that this force exists. His first example is disease. Here he talks about how there are many bacteria that are all around us and we are perfectly healthy, but in some individuals these same bacteria can cause disease and even death. So he says that this force is the difference between being healthy and sick. His second example is severe accidents. In this example, he talks about how people can come out of these severe accidents completely unharmed, and no one knows how that was possible. He says that this is grace that has protected them. His third point is evolution. Here he goes into the second law of thermodynamics. A basic explanation of the second law of thermodynamics is that the universe moves from an ordered state to a disordered state, and thus evolution is the opposite of this. It takes things from a disordered state to a more ordered state, and thus this is a miracle and must be guided by some force, which he calls grace. And then finally at the end of the book, he starts to talk about some more abstract concepts. These concepts can be controversial as he goes into the purpose of spiritual growth. And his view is that the ultimate purpose of spiritual growth is to become God. And this is an interesting concept, as some people will be completely against this, but others who are more in line with the New Age movement might agree with this concept. Let me know in the comments below what your view on this concept is. Thanks for watching. If you like this type of content, please subscribe and let me know in the comments below any books you would like reviewed.